In pouring alginate impressions for complete dentures, and for that matter pouring the same type of impressions for removable partial dentures, we like to do what's known as a two-pour technique. That means that basically we're going to use two separate procedures. We're going to pour the impression surface full of material, then we're going to wait for that material to go through in its initial set without ever inverting it. And we're going to wait until, in such a way, we want to store this material as it's going through the initial set in such a way that it doesn't distort. And the easy way to do that is after we get the impression filled with material, we're going to place it in the crack of a drawer like so. And then we'll let it set like that so it won't distort. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a mix of dental stone, yellow stone, and we're going to pour the impression surfaces. We do that by basically starting with a relatively small amount of water. In fact, that may be even a little bit too much water right there, so I'm going to pour a little of it off. Now we're going to sift the material into the water, putting the powder into the water and sift it into it until we build up a mound of dry material in the middle of that pool of water. And we want a relatively heavy mix, but a mix that will vibrate and run fairly well under the force of a vibrator. So about like this, and you see we have a lot of dry powder built up in the middle with a little excess water around the outside. So what you do is decant off the excess water, about like so. And now when we mix that, it should give us a nice creamy mix, a little thinner perhaps than a putty-like consistency, more like sour cream. That sort of a consistency. As you can see, it's a nice consistency that should vibrate and flow quite well. And once you have it mixed fairly well, no dry material in it, everything has been wetted, then I like to put it on the vibrator and let the vibrator work any air bubbles up to the surface. And we can see those bubbles working up to the surface as we vibrate the material. And once we've done that, you turn your vibrator down a little bit, get it on a lower level of vibration, and then we're going to place the material starting in one side and let it run all over the impression surface, and just totally fill the impression surface with this initial pour, and just let it get barely full enough till it covers the peripheries, like so. Maybe a little bit more right back here. And now with that, we're going to allow that to set before we put a base on it. And we do that by just placing it into a crack in the drawer and just let it support itself like that until we have initial set on the material. We'll do the same thing with the lower now by starting it at one side and let it fill the impression. And once it's covered, pretty well covered all of your impression surface, I find that if you take it off the vibrator and then just start working the material, adding it to one side and building it up over the periphery, it works quite well. You don't have to vibrate that part of it into the entire impression surface. Just let it build up like so. And now we're going to place that into the crack of the drawer like we did with the maxillary one. And we're going to let those set just like that until such time as it has initial set. How do we know when we have initial set? Initial set, you know when you have initial set of the material when it loses its gloss and turns to a matte finish. And when it turns to a matte finish, then we'll be ready to make our next pour and pour a base to it. After your material has reached its initial set, you will note that it no longer has a gloss. It now has a matte finish to it. And it has gone through the crystallization, the initial part of the crystallization process, and it's ready now for the second pour. Now, one of the reasons why we didn't want to set this down on the table like this before while that material was still set, as you'll notice if you set it down on the table, these things are flexible and you can distort this part of your impression very easily if you just set it on the table. Or sometimes the part at the posterior part of a maxillary may be hanging down there to the point that if you set it down it would distort it. So if you hang it in the drawer, that doesn't happen for you. In addition to that, if we inverted this onto a pad like this while it was still in its initial set, before it got to that initial set, when we first, a fresh mix of it, the material would tend to drain away from the impression and you would end up with a distorted cast out of it. So what we're going to do now is to make a thicker mix of material than what we started with, and we want this mix of material to be almost putty-like in consistency, and we're going to pour the bases to these. And the way we do that is we're going to start with a fair amount of water, like so, and we're going to need quite a bit of material. So maybe a better way of doing this at this point, rather than trying to dip it out with a spatula or something, is to just to sift it a little at a time from the one bowl end to the other. And we're going to put a fair amount of material in there and build up quite a good mound of material in the middle of it with water around it. A little bit too much water to begin with, so I'm going to drain some of that off. Mound about like so, and decant the excess water off of it now. That should give us a pretty stiff mix. Let's see how this works out for us. Yeah, this is going to be fine. A nice stiff mix of material that's going to be putty-like in consistency. This is just about right. See how nice and stiff it is, and the material is putty-like in consistency. And that's what you're looking for your second pour. Now to do that, we're going to make two little pads of material on these slabs that we have for us here that's going to form the base for us. And we like freehand pouring of these bases rather than those plastic or rubber base formers that you have in pedo ortho. We like to freehand these because it really allows us to shape the cast much better than it does with the other types. So what we're going to do now is we've made a little pad of material that's maybe a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in thickness. Then we're going to invert the impression and seat it right down onto that, and then push it down until the impression surface is about 1/2 inch from the base that we have on it, the slick slab of a base. Then take your spatula and pull the material, the excess material, up into the periphery of it all the way around. Rather than pushing the impression down now onto the material till it records all the periphery, pull the material up to the impression now, like so. With the lower, take your spatula and smooth it out to a nice smooth pad of material that's approximately 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch in thickness. Invert your impression, place it on it, and only insert it till you see the edge of the impression coming down, like in here or around here, the edge of the periphery of that impression coming down to meet the pad of material. Don't push it on down into it. Now, we can take the material at this point, any excess that we have, build that posterior up underneath the retromolar pad area on both sides. Any excess material you got, just scoop it up and build it up around the retromolar pad area. Pull the material up to the impression around the remainder of the buckle of it, like so. Then most important, and what I see most often of cast from students, is they tend to leave this tongue space filled with impression or with dental stone. So take your spatula at this point and come in there and just smooth that out and take it down to the level of the edge of the impression, which was here. Right there's a little void, so we can push the material into that. That's no big deal. And then take your spatula and smooth it out, smooth that tongue space out till you no longer have material coming up and trying to fill the tongue space. And just smooth it like so. Now once you have this part of it done and the material pulled up to the impression all the way around, what I like to do is to take your spatula and remove excess material. You can do that and keep from having to spend so much time on the cast trimmer by basically taking your spatula and cutting the excess material off. But as you cut, push your spatula towards the impression, like so. And you can get rid of some of that excess material which we will just have to spend time. If you didn't take this off, you'd have to spend time at the cast trimmer trimming it off, like so. Just push it and cut the excess off. And around this labial, you may have a little more problem with that, just getting to it, so it comes in at an angle. Just leave a little at the base of it so that you can make sure that you do have enough material for it. And then smooth it up again once you get that done. And now we can let that set until the material is set all the way. We do the same thing on the mandibular one by pushing it towards the impression and getting rid of the excess as we do that. And do that all the way around. And then again, on the anterior, get as much of that off as we can without actually getting into the impression surface. That way we have minimized the amount of material on the base of the cast, so that we're not going to have to spend all day at the cast trimmer once they're separated. Now at this point we're going to allow the stone to set with those impressions for about 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, that base material will have hardened almost to its maximum hardness, but certainly to a point that you can safely separate the impression from the cast and trim your cast. After the stone is set all the way, which basically means a minimum of 40 minutes, we need to separate the impression from the cast. We do that by gently placing a knife under the edge of the periphery of that metal tray and just prying a little bit. And we do that in a couple of areas, and generally you'll find that those trays will just work loose from the cast. Like so. Looks like we've got a nice pour of it. And we separate the lower. We do exactly the same thing, in that we'll work a knife underneath the edge of the tray, get it partway separated, and then remove the impression from the cast, and it looks like we have a nice pour of that one. Now that we've separated the impression from the stone cast, we need to trim it until it's nice and neat. The idea of trimming it is get rid of all of the excess material without destroying any of the impression surface. So we start trimming it, but we trim it down on the cast trimmer, making sure that there's lots of water on that blade as we trim. And as we come around with it, we'll just trim it real nice and round, trimming it in such a way that we preserve all of the impression surface with the exception of this vertical walls that come up. The remainder of this little lip that we see coming up along here will be trimmed with a knife after we're finished trimming on the cast trimmer. The mandibular cast is trimmed in a similar fashion. This is about all you can do with the cast trimmer itself, is we trim it in such a way that we have a little knife trimming to do in areas to make it good and neat. But basically we're through with the cast trimmer, and we're now ready to do a little knife trimming on the cast. Now that we're through trimming on the cast and getting these vertical walls trimmed in on the cast, we want to trim the periphery of the impression surface, like around these areas where it's sharp, and we want to trim it in such a way that we can take the ball of our finger and work all the way to the bottom of that periphery. And the way to do that is to take a knife, a good sharp knife, and cut that. We call this area the land area. We trim that down far enough that we can take our finger and work all the way to the bottom of that peripheral roll. And we do that all the way around so that we're able to, with our finger, be able to get down into the bottom of that roll and to mold things down into it. We do that for both the maxillary and the mandibular cast. And I usually start that mandibular by this vertical wall on the distal lingual. And I like to trim up this little bit of lingual area that we have in here because it just makes it a lot easier to work with if you trim that up. We always end up with a little area right here, a little nodule, and I'll trim that off. And that leaves us a real nice, well-trimmed area so that we can get down into these areas and work. I'm going to rinse these off and then we'll get a good shot of the way the finished cast looks. On our maxillary, we have it trimmed down so that all of the anatomy all the way around this periphery is recorded within the impression and within the cast. We have trimmed the land area down so far that we can take our finger and work all the way down into the base of that periphery, all the way around the cast. And that's what our cast should look like once it's trimmed and ready for proceeding with tray construction. We have exactly the same thing on the mandibular cast in that all of these areas around the land area are trimmed far enough down till we can work all the way into the periphery with the finger. The same is true on the lingual, just as it is on the facial portions of it. And these casts at this point are ready for construction of trays. Construction of trays on these casts, however, works a little bit better if we allow these casts to dry a little bit so we don't have a wet surface before we start the next procedure.